$47 million. That is the amount of dark money that flowed into J.D. Vance's political operation between 2021 and 2024. Money whose origins he has repeatedly refused to disclose under oath, money that congressional investigators have been attempting to trace for 19 months, and money that would finally be accounted for in full on a Wednesday afternoon in February when a first-term Congresswoman from Texas would do what no investigative body had managed to accomplish. By the time the hearing concluded, Vance would confess to something on live television that his legal team had spent 2 years ensuring he would never have to say. One folder, labeled simply Deutsche Bank, unredacted, would haunt him forever. What made him finally break? You're going to want to hear this. The Senate Oversight Subcommittee hearing on campaign finance transparency had been scheduled for 3 weeks. J.D. Vance entered the chamber at 2:47 p.m. with the bearing of a man who believed the outcome had already been determined in his favor. He had testified before congressional committees 17 times in the previous 2 years. He had survived everyone. He wore a Navy suit that cost more than most Americans earned in a month, his Yale Law School class ring visible as he adjusted the microphone, his expression communicating something between boredom and contempt. He nodded to Republican committee members who smiled back. He ignored the Democrats entirely. When he sat, he leaned back in his chair with the ease of someone who had never been truly challenged in a room like this and did not expect today to be different. Jasmine Crockett sat 4 seats to his left. She was junior on the committee. She had been in Congress for less than 2 full terms. Vance had made a point of this in a Fox News interview 3 days earlier, calling her selection to the subcommittee a perfect example of identity politics over competence. He had said it with a smile, the kind of dismissal that sounds polite on air but communicates absolute contempt to anyone listening carefully. She had not responded publicly. She had simply continued preparing. The hearing began with opening statements from senior members. Vance testified for 31 minutes without interruption, reading from prepared remarks that his legal team had vetted for a week. He spoke about the importance of free speech in campaign finance. He quoted the Citizens United decision from memory. He described his donors as patriots who believe in the future of this country, and his fundraising operation as the most transparent in modern Senate history. He cited 3 internal audits his team had commissioned, all of which found no violations of disclosure law. He mentioned his compliance officer by name twice. He gestured to a binder in front of him containing what he described as every legally required filing submitted on time, available to the public. His tone throughout was that of a man educating children on subjects they could not possibly understand without his guidance. When he finished, he took a sip of water and placed both hands flat on the table in a posture of openness. He smiled at the committee. The message was clear. He had come, he had complied, and there was nothing more to discuss. Several Republican members thanked him for his transparency. The chairman asked if there were questions. Crockett raised her hand. Vance glanced at her briefly, then looked back to the chairman as though he had not seen her. The chairman recognized her. Vance's face remained neutral, but something in his posture shifted microscopically, a barely perceptible tightening around the shoulders. Crockett did not begin with a question. She began with a statement of fact, delivered in the same tone a librarian might use to inform someone their book was overdue. She said that she had reviewed the 3 internal audits Vance referenced and found them professionally conducted within their stated scope. She said his compliance officer appeared qualified and his public filings were indeed submitted on time. She acknowledged that on the surface, his operation appeared to meet the minimum legal standard. Then she paused. She opened the first folder in front of her with the care of someone handling evidence in a courtroom, which, in a functional sense, this was. She said that appearances, however, can be incomplete. Vance's smile thinned slightly. He shifted his weight forward. It was the first tell. The folder contained financial disclosures from the Federal Election Commission covering Vance's 2022 Senate campaign. Crockett did not need to consult notes. She recited from memory that Vance's campaign had reported $4 million in total contributions, with 18's $7 million coming from individual donors whose identities were disclosed as required by law. That left 12. $7 million categorized as coming from political action committees and super PACs, all of which were listed by name in the public filings. Vance nodded along as though this confirmed his earlier testimony. Crockett continued. She said that when one follows those PAC names to their own disclosure forms, an interesting pattern emerges. Of the $12, $7 million, approximately 9. $3 million came from just 4 super PACs. All 4 were formed in the same 3-month window in early 2022. All four listed the same registered agent in Delaware. All four dissolved within 6 months of the election. And all four, when required to disclose their own donor sources, listed only other PACs in a chain that eventually led back to shell entities with no disclosed human contributors. Vance leaned toward his microphone. He said that super PACs operate independently under the law and that his campaign had no control over their internal structures. He said this with the confidence of someone who had delivered that exact line in multiple depositions and knew it to be legally accurate. Crockett nodded as though conceding the point. She said that was absolutely correct. She said she was not suggesting his campaign controlled those entities. She was simply noting the pattern. Then she opened the second folder. This one was thicker. The tabs were color-coded. Vance's eyes tracked to it. For the first time, he did not look confident. He looked like a man calculating how much the person across from him actually knew. The second folder contained bank records, not summaries, not excerpts. Complete monthly statements from 4 financial institutions covering a period of 19 months. Crockett explained that these records had been obtained through a subpoena issued by the Oversight Committee 6 weeks earlier, a subpoena that Vance's legal team had fought unsuccessfully to block. She said the statements showed wire transfers totaling $11, $2 million moving from foreign-held accounts into the 4 super PACs during the precise window they were funding Vance's campaign. The accounts were held at Deutsche Bank's Cayman Islands branch. The beneficial owners of those accounts were listed on internal Deutsche Bank documents that the bank had been legally required to maintain, but not required to disclose publicly. Until now. Crockett placed a single sheet of paper on the table in front of her, visible to the cameras. It was a list of 17 names. She read the first name. It belonged to a Russian oligarch currently under sanctions by the U.S. Treasury Department. The second name was a UAE-based holding company that had been flagged by the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network for potential money laundering. The third was a shell entity registered in the British Virgin Islands with no disclosed operations, no employees, and no publicly acknowledged purpose beyond holding capital. Vance's face had gone from confident to carefully neutral. He said that he had no knowledge of those entities. He said that super PACs are legally prohibited from coordinating with campaigns, and that he could not be held responsible for the sources of their funding. His voice was steady but quieter than before. Crockett did not respond immediately. She let the silence extend. 5 seconds. 10. The room was completely still. Even the court reporter had stopped typing. Then Crockett opened the third folder. She said that she agreed campaigns and super PACs could not coordinate. Federal law was very clear on that point, which made certain discoveries in the subpoenaed records particularly interesting. She produced an email dated March 14, 2022, sent from an address registered to Vance's campaign finance director to an address registered to the treasurer of one of the 4 super PACs. The subject line read, "Updated targeting data, Ohio media markets." Attached to the email was a spreadsheet containing voter demographics, media buy recommendations, and polling data specific to 12 Ohio counties. Crockett noted that sharing polling data and strategic targeting information between a campaign and a super PAC constitutes illegal coordination under 52 U.S.C. 3116. Vance's attorney, seated behind him, leaned forward and whispered something. Vance did not respond. His hands, which had been resting flat on the table, were now gripping its edge. Crockett continued. She said the email was not an isolated incident. The subpoenaed records contained 47 separate communications between Vance campaign staff and the treasurers or directors of the 4 super PACs over a 6-month period. The communications included strategic advice, donor lists, opposition research, and in one case, a draft script for a television ad that ran verbatim 3 weeks later under the super PAC's name. She said this level of coordination was not a gray area. It was explicit and extensively documented. Vance interrupted. His voice was louder now. He said that if such communications occurred, they were unauthorized and his campaign leadership was not aware of them. He said that rogue staffers do not implicate the candidate. Crockett looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then she asked if he was testifying under oath that he personally had no knowledge of coordination between his campaign and the super PACs funding his race. Vance hesitated. It was the smallest pause, less than 2 seconds, but in a hearing room, it carried the weight of a confession. He said he was not personally involved in day-to-day finance operations. Crockett did not ask him to clarify. She simply moved to the 4th folder. This folder was labeled Signal Messages Recovered. Crockett explained that Signal is an encrypted messaging application that automatically deletes messages after a set period unless the user manually preserves them. She said that Vance's campaign finance director had used Signal to communicate with super PAC operatives, believing those conversations would vanish. What the director did not know was that one of the super PAC operatives had preserved the full message history and turned it over to investigators under a confidentiality agreement. Crockett read from the messages. March 9, 2022, from the campaign finance director to a super PAC treasurer. JD wants the rural buy increased by $400K. Can you cover it? Response. Done. Wiring today. March 22nd, 2022. JD reviewed the latest ad cut. He wants the line about Social Security removed. Too risky. Response. Editing now. New version up by Friday. April 11th, 2022. JD's polling shows he's underwater with women 45-60. Need contrast ads on the opponent ASAP? Response, we've got too narrow cleared for that. Launching Monday. The room was silent. Vance's attorney was now writing frantically on a legal pad. Vance himself sat motionless. His face had lost the easy confidence of 30 minutes earlier. Crockett said that the messages made clear that Vance was not a passive recipient of independent expenditure support. He was actively directing the strategy, the spending, and the content of the super PACs that were legally prohibited from coordinating with him. She said this was not a matter of interpretation. The messages were explicit. Vance finally spoke. He said that those messages, if authentic, were taken out of context. He said that political shorthand often sounds more direct than the reality. He said that asking a super PAC to cover spending did not mean coordination. It meant expressing a general hope. His voice had risen. The calm authority of his opening testimony was gone. He was now in the defensive crouch of a man who knew the walls were closing. Crockett did not argue with him. She simply opened the fifth folder. This one contained financial records of a different kind. Tax returns? Not Vance's personal returns, which remain private, but the returns of a limited liability company registered in Ohio under the name Appalachian Future Fund, LLC. The company had been formed in January 2022. Its registered agent was a law firm in Columbus that specialized in political compliance. Its stated purpose was civic education and advocacy. Crockett explained that the Appalachian Future Fund had received $8 million in contributions during 2022 from the same foreign-linked entities whose names she had read earlier. The fund then made expenditures totaling $6. $4 million, almost all of it going to media production companies, data firms, and consulting groups that also worked for Vance's official campaign. The fund was structured as a 501(c)(4) social welfare organization, which meant it was not required to disclose its donors publicly, but it was required to report its activities to the IRS. And the IRS records, obtained through subpoena, told a very clear story. She read from the fund's tax filing. Under primary exempt purpose, the form listed educating voters on economic policy in Ohio. Under program service accomplishments, it described producing and airing advertisements informing Ohio voters about the dangers of current economic policies. Crockett noted that every single advertisement listed in the filing aired during Vance's Senate race and explicitly attacked his opponent by name. She said that calling these ads civic education rather than campaign expenditures was legally dubious at best. More importantly, the fund's expenditure reports showed that $4. $1 million had gone to firms owned or operated by individuals who also held formal positions in Vance's campaign or in the coordinating super PACs. The money was moving in a circle, foreign funds into the LLC. LLC expenditures to vendors. Vendors working simultaneously for the campaign and super PACs coordinating strategy. The entire structure was a pass-through designed to obscure the origin of millions of dollars in foreign money influencing a U.S. Senate race. Vance's attorney stood and requested a recess. The chairman denied the request. Vance leaned back in his chair, his hands now folded in front of his face. Crockett continued. She said she wanted to address Vance's earlier statement that his operation was the most transparent in modern Senate history. She said she had compared his disclosure practices to the previous 5 Ohio Senate races. In those races, an average of 91% of total campaign funding came from traceable individual donors or transparently disclosed PACs. In Vance's race, that figure was 59%. The remaining 41%, nearly $13 million, had moved through the layered structure she had just described. She said that by any objective standard, Vance's operation was not the most transparent. It was among the least transparent in recent Ohio political history, and the lack of transparency appeared to be by design. She opened the sixth folder. This one was the thinnest, containing only 3 documents. The first was an internal memo from Vance's legal team dated February 2022, 2 months before the primary. The memo outlined a strategy for maximizing outside support while maintaining legal separation. It recommended the creation of multiple super PACs with different registered agents to distribute risk and obscure contribution patterns. It suggested using encrypted communications for all strategic discussions to avoid creating discoverable records. It explicitly stated that the goal was to ensure that even in the event of an FEC audit, the full scope of coordination would be difficult to prove. Crockett noted that this memo was not a compliance document. It was a roadmap for evading disclosure requirements while maintaining the appearance of legality. Vance had gone pale. He said nothing. The second document was an email from Vance himself, sent from his personal account to his campaign chairman on March 3, 2022. The email was brief. It read, "Spoke to the Delaware contact. They can move the funds through the structure we discussed. Completely insulated. No exposure." Crockett let that sentence hang in the air. She did not editorialize. She did not need to. The words spoke for themselves. Vance had personally discussed moving funds through the shell structure his legal team had designed for the purpose of obscuring their origin. He had used the word insulated, which in this context could only mean insulated from disclosure. He had written no exposure, meaning no legal or political exposure from the true sources of the money. This was not a rogue staffer. This was the candidate himself in writing, acknowledging a scheme to hide the origin of campaign funds. Vance finally spoke. His voice was quieter now, almost hoarse. He said that the email was discussing legal fundraising strategies and that there was nothing improper about using PAC structures that were permitted under campaign finance law. Crockett asked him a simple question. She asked if the Delaware contact he referenced was in fact a representative of one of the foreign entities whose money had funded the super PACs. The silence that followed was absolute. The cameras were locked on Vance's face. His jaw worked as though he were trying to form words, but no sound came. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Someone in the press gallery coughed, and the sound was sharp enough to make several people flinch. Vance's hands were gripping the table so tightly that his knuckles had gone white. Finally, he said he would need to consult his records to answer that question accurately. Crockett did not ask a follow-up. She simply nodded and moved to the final document. The third document in the folder was a whistleblower statement from a former treasurer of one of the dissolved super PACs. The treasurer had come forward 3 weeks earlier under the protection of federal whistleblower statutes. Her statement, given under oath to Oversight Committee investigators, described in detail how the super PAC had been used as a conduit for foreign money. She named specific individuals who had facilitated the transfers. She described meetings where Vance's campaign staff had provided strategic direction. She included contemporaneous notes from those meetings, photographs of documents she had been instructed to destroy, and recordings of phone calls in which campaign officials discussed the need to keep certain donors off the books. Crockett said that the whistleblower's testimony had been corroborated by bank records, email metadata, and testimony from 2 other witnesses who had been granted immunity in exchange for cooperation. The pattern was undeniable. Vance had not simply failed to prevent illegal coordination. He had actively participated in designing and implementing a system to funnel foreign money into his race while maintaining plausible deniability. Crockett paused. She said she wanted to be very clear about what this meant. This was not a technical violation of an obscure regulation. This was not a paperwork error or a reporting delay. This was a sitting U.S. senator who had financed his election with millions of dollars in foreign money, obscured the sources through shell entities and illegal coordination, and then testified under oath that his operation was transparent. She said that foreign money in American elections is prohibited because it represents foreign influence over American policy. Every dollar that flowed from those Cayman accounts into Vance's super PACs represented a compromise of the democratic process. And Vance had not only allowed it, he had orchestrated it. She opened the final folder. This one was not labeled. Inside was a photograph. It showed Vance at a private event in May 2022, shaking hands with a man whose face Crockett did not identify on camera, but whose name appeared in the Deutsche Bank records as one of the beneficial owners of the accounts that had funded the super PACs. The photograph had been taken by a private security contractor working the event. It had been obtained through a subpoena of the contractor's company. Vance was smiling in the photograph. The other man's hand was on Vance's shoulder. They were standing close, the posture of people who knew each other well. Crockett placed the photograph on the table where the cameras could see it clearly. She said that Vance had testified in a prior hearing that he had no personal contact with any of the foreign donors whose money had funded his race. She asked if he would like to revise that testimony now. Vance stared at the photograph. His mouth opened. No words came. His attorney was now whispering urgently in his ear. Vance shook his head slightly as though trying to clear it. Then he did something no one in the room expected. He asked for the microphone to be turned off. The chairman informed him that the hearing was public and the microphone would remain on. Vance's face had gone from pale to flushed. Sweat was visible at his hairline despite the cool temperature of the room. He took a long breath. Then he said, and these were his exact words, "I met with donors who were cleared by my finance team. If some of those donors had foreign ties I was not made aware of, that is a failure of vetting, not intent." Crockett did not let it stand. She asked if he was testifying that the man in the photograph, a man whose name appeared on Treasury Department sanctions lists and whose financial activities had been the subject of multiple federal investigations, was simply a donor he met without knowledge of his background. Vance said yes. Crockett asked if his finance team conducted any background checks on donors before arranging private meetings. Vance said they conducted standard reviews. Crockett asked what a standard review entailed. Vance said he was not personally involved in the vetting process. Crockett asked who was. Vance named his finance director. Crockett asked if that was the same finance director whose signal messages she had read earlier, the one who had coordinated directly with the super PACs. Vance did not answer. The silence stretched again. This time it lasted 23 seconds. It was counted later by multiple news organizations who pulled the C-SPAN footage. 23 seconds of a United States senator unable to answer a straightforward question about his own campaign's vetting procedures. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. He said he could not recall the specific procedures his finance director used. Crockett thanked him for his honesty. The sarcasm was so subtle it was almost undetectable, but it landed. Vance flinched. Crockett closed all the folders in front of her. She stacked them neatly. Then she delivered her closing statement, and she did so without notes, looking directly at Vance the entire time. She said that public service is a public trust. She said that voters send representatives to Washington because they believe those representatives will act in the interest of the American people, not in the interest of foreign nationals seeking to buy influence. She said that transparency in campaign finance is not a bureaucratic formality. It is the foundation of democratic accountability. When a candidate obscures the sources of their funding, they are telling voters that the public has no right to know who is purchasing access and influence. And when a candidate accepts millions of dollars from foreign sources while claiming to be transparent, they are not simply lying to voters. They are betraying the constitutional principle that American elections are decided by Americans. She said that Vance had entered this hearing claiming to be the most transparent candidate in modern history. The evidence showed the opposite. He had built a deliberate system to hide foreign money, coordinated illegally with outside groups, and then testified under oath that his operation was clean. She said that the question now was not whether violations had occurred. The evidence was conclusive. The question was what consequences would follow. She said she would be referring the complete evidentiary record to the Department of Justice for criminal investigation. She would be filing a formal ethics complaint with the Senate Ethics Committee, and she would be introducing legislation to close the loopholes that had allowed this kind of conduct to occur. She said she did not expect Vance to support that legislation, but she wanted him to know that the American people were watching. And they would remember. Vance's attorney leaned forward and said something sharp into Vance's ear. Vance stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. He said he had cooperated fully with this hearing and had nothing further to add. He said his legal team would respond to any referrals through appropriate channels. Then he turned and walked toward the exit. He did not look back. The cameras followed him all the way to the door. Just before he reached it, one of the reporters in the gallery shouted a question asking if he regretted taking foreign money. Vance did not answer. He pushed through the door and disappeared into the hallway. The hearing room was silent for a long moment after he left. Then the murmur of conversation began, quiet at first, then building. Crockett remained seated. She did not celebrate. She did not smile. She simply gathered her folders, thanked the chairman, and yielded her time. But before she stood to leave, she said one final thing. She said that at the beginning of this hearing, some had questioned whether she had the experience or the qualifications to examine a matter this complex. She said she appreciated the concern, but she wanted to be clear this was not about experience. It was about preparation. And she had been preparing for exactly this moment since the day she learned that foreign money was corrupting American democracy. She said she hoped her work today had been sufficient. Then she stood and walked out of the chamber. The folders went with her. The evidence remained on the record. And J.D. Vance's political future, which had seemed so secure when he entered that room 90 minutes earlier, was now in the hands of federal prosecutors and the American voters who would decide whether a senator who lied about his donors deserved to remain in office. $47 million. That is what it cost. And in the end, it bought him nothing but exposure.